Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 727 for September 23rd, 2018. This time around, I'm on location in Louisville, Kentucky for this weekend's Bourbon and Beyond Music, Whiskey, Food, and Rain Festival at Champions Park. Coming up in just a few minutes.
He strikes a deal with my dad for him to stay alive long enough to roll out the 6 millionth barrel. Dad, in the process, tells him that he's got this son that he needs to get him a job. And Mark says, well, send him down to the distillery. We'll try to find something for him to do. I become a tour guide. Dad gets a chance to roll out the 6 millionth barrel. And at 94 years old, he had become the only living person to personally handle every millionth barrel that had ever come through that distillery since Prohibition.
Saturday, I moderated a bourbon storytelling panel at Bourbon and Beyond, and Freddie Johnson, one of the newest members of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, was on the panel. We sat down after the session for a one-on-one talk about family, life, and race, and how bourbon brought them all together for 3 generations of the Johnson family. That's coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and more highlights from this weekend at Bourbon and Beyond in Louisville, all on this special edition of WhiskyCast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Before we start with the news, I need to note that I'm not actually recording this entire episode at Champions Park. Louisville has had heavy rain that started briefly on Friday afternoon, and by noon on Saturday, a massive storm system moved in from the west and settled in over the city. We've had a couple of inches of rain here in the last 24 hours, and with another inch of rain and a flash flood watch in the forecast for today, city officials made the decision early this morning to declare the park unsafe for the closing day of the festival. Now, when I left Champions Park last night, I was sinking a couple of inches into the mud with each step, and conditions got even worse overnight. So, with today's activities canceled, I'm recording this episode on the covered patio at the hotel. And for what it's worth, I think the city made the right decision. Safety always has to come first. Let's move ahead with the news now. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Workers at the Four Roses Bourbon Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and its bottling and maturation site in Cox's Creek will be back on the job Monday morning. As we reported first at WhiskyCast.com on Friday evening, the distillery and its 3 unions reached a tentative agreement to end the 2-week-long strike. The deal came after several hours of talks Friday to resolve differences over sick leave. Current employees can carry over unused sick days from year to year with a maximum of 60 days. But the Kirin-owned distillery wanted to end that for new workers and replace it with a plan that includes short-term disability insurance that kicks in after an employee uses up all of their sick days for the year. Leaders of the United Food and Commercial Workers, Locals 10D and 23D, and the National Conference of Firemen and Oilers, Local 320, flatly refused anything that would create a 2-tiered system with different levels of benefits for future employees. But as UFCW Local 10D President Jeff Royalty told us Friday night after the settlement was reached, they found a way to come to a compromise that works for both sides.
It was just really good to see their interest in making sure that we got what we need, and with also making sure the company got what they needed, So it was a very prosperous day, I think, for both sides. And, as a union man, I'd like to take victory. But in that, I would like to also state that I do not consider it anything but a victory for the company also. when a company and their employees can get together and work things out that I feel is beneficial to both sides, I mean, everybody wins at this point.
Did you get what you wanted?
I absolutely did. And without going into great detail, essentially, we now have an option. And that's kind of what we were after all along. No one knows what's best for their family but that individual. So rather having something thrust upon you, a different type of sick leave or something of that nature, the company has agreed to let us make a one-time choice. For instance, I have the choice of either keeping my existing sick days the way they are, or I can sign up for the new system and do that. But some people, what I would call a two-tier is, when you don't have a choice. You get this, the next guy gets whatever, and that's just the way it is. But these guys understood how serious we were about that and how damaging I thought that would be for everything and everybody involved. So they sat down with us and got it worked out. So everybody, including a new hire, will have a one-time choice to make of which type of sick leave plan they want to be a part of.
Was the strike worth it then after 2 weeks?
I think it was. As we've always said, this has never been about money specifically. I mean, you can tie anything you do to an economic package. But I honestly think that, we lost a couple weeks' pay. And, that being said, I think it was the best money I've ever spent because I know that the 53 of us have potentially given 53 other people in the future a chance. And, by doing that, I mean, that's stuff that you just can't buy.
Four Roses executives declined interview requests after announcing the settlement in a news release, but said in that statement that they look forward to resuming full production soon. The distillery was shut down well before the strike began for the final phase of construction on a $55 million expansion project. All three union locals are expected to hold ratification votes on the 5-year contract this coming week. Now, that dispute was much easier to resolve than the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China appears to be. China is tacking on new tariffs for American whiskeys and other spirits, along with wine and beer this coming week, along with a variety of other American exports. That comes on top of the punitive tariffs China imposed back in July. That follows U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to raise tariffs starting this week on another $200 billion worth of imports from China. The Wall Street Journal reported this weekend that China has also canceled plans for high-level trade talks between the two countries this week in Washington. Here in Louisville, Mayor Greg Fisher has made bourbon a key part of the city's image and its economic development. 5 years ago, the University of Louisville released its first study of the impact of the bourbon industry on the area's economic development. And that's around the time Mayor Fisher coined the term bourbonism, with a goal of making bourbon and food a year-round draw for tourists. Now, the mayor's working on what he calls Bourbonism 2.0.
The goals that we set in the first year were 5 years goals. Most of those we surpassed in 3 years. So we're thinking now about a lot bigger things as well. It's not just culinary and music and art and tourism, workforce development. It's research and development and innovation also. So we think we're just at the very beginnings of bourbonism and what it's going to do for the bourbon industry.
You can only take it so far to the south, right? Before you run into Bardstown.
Well, Bardstown and Louisville come together. They're the bourbon capital. We're the bourbon epicenter, okay? But when you think about the potential we have and the relatively small share of 15 to 20% that bourbon has of the brown spirits category, so there's all kind of room for us to grow. And I know I'm maybe a little favored this way, but, I think that bourbon selection compared to Scotch selection, there's no comparison. Of course, you'd expect me to say that as the mayor of Louisville. So I think we have got a lot of upside with global market share. So I think we're in the very, very early days of bourbonism.
During a news conference Friday afternoon, Mayor Fisher and Bourbon and Beyond promoter Danny Wimmer Presents announced plans to expand next year's festival to 3 days, along with a new country music and bourbon festival called Hometown Rising, to be held the weekend before that at Champions Park, east of downtown along the Ohio River. When you combine that with Louder Than Life, the rock festival that is still scheduled for this coming weekend. That gives Louisville 3 major music festivals on 3 consecutive weekends.
80,000 new jobs in the last 4 to 5 years, 2,600 new businesses, $13 billion in capital investment in the last 4 years. I mean, this is what you see happening, going on all around our city. And Bourbon and Beyond is a really important part of the strategy of growth that we have for our city. It's not just, when you put bourbon and food together, that's what we call bourbonism. But Danny, I think we need to add, bourbon, food, and music, because that's really kind of what you guys have helped us with. And it's a big part of the growth strategy of our city. CNBC last month named the top 15 millennial growth cities in the country. We were fortunate to be on that list. And I really believe one of the reasons we're on that list is bourbonism. Bourbon, local food, great music, great art scene that people want to be around.
That news conference was held at the Old Forester Distillery, which opened in June on Main Street, also known as Whiskey Row. It's just one of the many bourbon-related projects that has changed downtown Louisville. Brown-Forman invested more than $50 million to bring Old Forester back to its original roots, with a combined distillery and visitors experience on the same site where the company was located from 1882 to 1919. Campbell Brown is the president of Old Forester.
It's been about 90 days and things are great. Everything works. We're making great whiskey, and it's been put away for a few years now, and we're excited to see how it all turns out in about 4 or 5 years.
How did the new make come off compared to the stuff from the original distillery?
Well, again, I'm not a distiller and would never pretend to be, but everything I've heard is that it's very clean. I think we're getting very efficient runs. The fermenters seem to be doing what they're supposed to do. We feel like it's probably going to be a little bit more refined. I think the more interesting thing is, given what we're aging and how we're aging it, and in a room where we've got people cycling through there, and it's not heat cycled like the warehouses in Shively, it'll be interesting to see if that has an impact on the flavor, and what if we blend it all or try to keep it very specific to this building. We're going to have a lot of fun over the next 4 years just checking in on that whiskey and seeing how it's progressing.
Campbell Brown also brought back another Old Forester tradition with the new distillery, the revival of President's Choice, a single-barrel bourbon that originated with his grandfather, who would select the barrels himself for special clients. Brown now selects the barrels for President's Choice with master taster Jackie Zykan. The latest barrel went on sale early Friday morning at the distillery and sold out almost immediately. We'll take a tour of Old Forester on an upcoming episode, but it's just one example of what has happened over the last 5 years in Louisville. 9 different bourbon-related tourist experiences have opened, starting with the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience downtown, to the Fraser History Museum's new bourbon exhibit that opened last month, along with the Kentucky Bourbon Trail's Welcome Center at the Fraser. You can also add a whole bunch of new bars and restaurants to that list. And in May, Rabbit Hole Distillery opened its doors to the public. Founder Kaveh Zamanian put a lot of money into the distillery's architecture to create a unique distillery experience.
It is, humbly said, pretty damn amazing. It is one of a kind in the sense that I wanted to make sure that we basically take away all the smoke and mirrors. It's a fully transparent distillery, and it's also a fully immersive experience. What that means is that you come in as a visitor, you're going to see everything and everybody who's behind the project. From grain to glass, you're going to see the process. And more importantly, you're going to be immersed in that manufacturing space. There's a spiral staircase that's going to literally elevate you off the manufacturing floor. And at the same time, you're going to be able to see everything in full view and land in our tasting room up top and enjoy the spirits.
As for Rabbit Hole's whiskeys, Zamanian is planning to release new cask-strength bourbon and rye bottlings later this fall. We'll have details when they're available. In other new whiskeys, Beam Suntory officially unveiled the second in Freddie No's Little Book series this week. This year's edition is nicknamed No Simple Task, N-O-E, of course. It's another unique blend, and there's not a single drop of bourbon in it. Freddie took 8-year-old Kentucky straight rye whiskey and blended it with 2 Canadian whiskeys, a 13-year-old rye and a 40-year-old 100% corn whiskey. The final blend is uncut and unfiltered. It's bottled at 59.4% ABV and will sell for around $100 a bottle. Luxco is releasing a new Ezra Brooks bourbon. Old Ezra Barrel Strength is a 7-year-old bourbon that's bottled at 58.5% ABV. It'll sell for around $40 a bottle. Distell unveiled 6 new single malts from its distilleries in Scotland this week at an event in London. The lineup ranges from a Deanston 2008 brandy cask finish that will sell for around £60 a bottle in the UK to the Bunnahabhain Palo Cortado cask finish. It'll carry a recommended retail price in the UK of £275. There are also new single malts from Tobermory and its peated Lechig brand. While I'm in Louisville this weekend, Whiskey Live is underway in Paris, and Glenfarclas unveiled a special edition of its Glenfarclas 105 single malt. The 22-year-old Glenfarclas 105 celebrates the 50th anniversary of the original release back in 1968. Like that original and every other 105 since, it's bottled at the original 105 British proof, which is now 60% ABV. Only 3,600 bottles will be available in selected markets around the world. No word on pricing. Let's update the story we brought you last weekend on the Art of Bourbon auction to benefit the Speed Art Museum here in Louisville as part of Bourbon and Beyond. Bottle number 10 of the original release of Pappy Van Winkle's 23-year-old Family Reserve Bourbon brought a winning bid of $19,500. Online bidding had reached $18,000 before Friday night's auction at the museum. And a single bottle of bourbon selected personally by Colonel Albert Blanton back in 1952 that was given back then to one of his employees sold for $10,500. All of the proceeds from Friday night's auction will support the museum's educational programs in Kentucky. Finally, what is the secret to a long, happy life? According to Great Britain's oldest woman, it's a nightly dram of whiskey. Grace Jones celebrated her 112th birthday last Sunday. She told reporters she's been having a glass of the famous grouse every night for the last 60 years and has no plans to stop now. Her doctor is fine with that, and so is her daughter, who is 80 years old and also has a dram every night. We should all be so lucky. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking Soul. If you're not a member of Highland Park's Inner Circle, you're missing out on the latest news from Orkney, along with the chance to get your hands on unique whiskeys like the Dolphins. No, Flipper did not pay a visit to Orkney. This is a special edition of Highland Park, created especially to honor the Royal Navy's submarine service. Until now, it's only been available on the Royal Navy sub-base at Faslane in Scotland, but now Inner Circle members can get it for a limited time. To join the Inner Circle, just visit HighlandParkWhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival gets underway this week on September 27th through the 29th and continues the weekend of October 4th through the 6th in Sweden. The Whiskey Extravaganza hits Chicago on September 27th. The Banff Whiskey Experience is September 28th and 29th in Banff, Alberta, and the Whiskey Show is on the 28th through the 30th at London's Old Billingsgate. Amrut's American Tour stops at Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C. on the 29th. And here in Louisville, Churchill Downs hosts Downs After Dark, Bourbon and Beats that same night. Right now, we have 220 different events on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just use the search button to find one near you or wherever you're traveling.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listerudition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listau. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listau edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Now, you see a lot of things at a combination bourbon and music festival, but a bunch of guys building stills is not normally one of them. I'm with Rob Sherman from Vendome, and you guys wanted to build a full still, didn't you, this weekend?
Correct. This is new for us. So when Danny came to us with Bourbon Beyond, we wanted to build a full still out here. So people would show up Saturday morning, see us start making parts. Sunday night, still be finished. They could come back and check on it and watch the whole thing through the whole start to finish process. All the welding, the hammer, and everything.
Didn't work out, though, did it?
Didn't work out. Fire Marshal he was a little nervous, kind of knocked us down just to making some little parts, but I think it's going to be successful.
And let's point out that he knocked you down because you guys were actually going to weld and stuff out here, right?
Right. We were going to weld, have big torches, big flames, and I think he was afraid of us maybe setting a tree on fire. So.
It's not like you guys haven't worked with these things for 115 years. You sort of know what you're doing.
I think we could do it without setting a tree on fire for sure.
Next year, though, right?
Next year we're going to bigger and better.
Now, I had to notice that across the way here, just back behind where we're standing, you guys actually had to set up a swag tent for the first time, right?
First time for a swag tent, and that kind of evolved from the Fire Marshal as well. So when we got vetoed on all our welding and fire, they split us into two tents. So we had this other tent we didn't know what to do with. So we thought, let's put some hats and shirts in and see how it goes. And I think there's been a line there all morning.
Yeah, because this is the first time you've ever actually sold stuff to the public, right?
It is. We have a little online store that's just kind of for people that call in all the time, but this is the first time we've been out selling. People know our name.
Oh, yeah, because we've seen Vendome logos on stills all over the world now. I mean, you guys are building stills not just for Kentucky, but literally anybody, right?
Oh, yeah, we build all over the world, a lot in the Caribbean for the rum industry, but our specialty is the bourbon industry. And it's funny, we have people in Louisville come up and say, I didn't even know y'all were in Louisville. I said, well, we've only been there for 115 years.
And you're down on the banks of the river?
We're down in Butchertown. Same place we've been since about 1896.
You can't go to a music festival without seeing guitars for sale. And we're in the music experience tent talking with Ron Williams and Dan Russell. Ron has done some unusual stuff with festival guitars in the past. You had to actually paint bourbon barrels on these guitars, right?
I have painted bourbon barrel guitars before, yes, I did. Yeah, last year was the first of Bourbon and Beyond, so I did last year's as well as this year's.
Now, with all the grain and everything that goes into a good bourbon barrel, that's got to be kind of hard to paint.
It's difficult. I mean, but, once you get the proper palette down, it's kind of nice because it's a random pattern, so I'm not held to by any parameters. So once you get the wood grain effect going, it kind of goes pretty smooth.
Where can people find these guitars?
Well, right now we're here at the Music Experience all weekend. We do all the Danny Wimmer festivals. So we're the official festival guitars for all of them. So we'll be here all weekend long. Usually we kind of go dark in between festivals, but if they want to visit my site for painted guitars, they can go to itsronsworld.com.
And that's RONZ, right?
Correct, that's RONZ, yes.
Now let's talk about actually taking bourbon barrels and turning them into guitars, because that's what you do.
Right. It was kind of a trick. One of the guitars, I started out with the side of the barrel, and honestly, it was like, I don't know what I got myself into on that. I managed to get it done, but the second attempt was the lid of the barrel, and which is a lot easier because it's flat. But they are all beveled, and I wanted to keep the effect on these barrels. I didn't want to join them up and make them tight, so you lost the actual different pieces. You know what I mean? So I managed to keep those and pulled a few hairs out on that, but. After all, it was turned out really awesome, and they sound great, and excited about it,
And these are a couple of custom guitars you did with Angel's Envy just down the road here in Louisville.
Yes, it is, and they came with a partnership to do this. It's two craftsmen. We have the distiller, and of course, I guess I'm the builder, and just came together, and it was just a fun project. It's. I don't know, we did the tour, and we got to bring the guitars around the shop, so all the workers got to see them.
What's the hardest part about working with bourbon staves? Because obviously they're bent, they're charred, and they're pretty well beat up before you get them, but the heads are easier to work with, right?
Yeah, but the heads are also charred too, so yes, I was filthy dirty when I was working with these things. I smelled good. My whole entire wood shop smelled like bourbon barrels, and it lasted for a couple days in there, so it was a challenge. It was a very good challenge.
Does the wood make the music sound better?
I didn't want to mess with it because oak's not a really common top, so I made thinner tops. It's more of an aesthetic. The backwoods I use is like some soft American ash, which sounds great. And we also used custom hand-wound pickups in these also, which we do in our shop also.
Dan is a master luthier at Dean Guitars and has made guitars for some of rock's leading musicians. We've posted links to their sites and Vendôme's online shop in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. WhiskeyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. As I mentioned earlier, part of the reason I'm here for Bourbon and Beyond this weekend was to be the moderator for a couple of bourbon panels. Saturday morning, we kicked off the weekend with a storytelling session featuring longtime whiskey writer Chuck Cowdery, Heaven Hill brand ambassador Bernie Lubbers, and one of the newest members of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, Freddie Johnson of Buffalo Trace. Freddie grew up around the distillery. His father, Jimmy Johnson Jr., and his grandfather, Jimmy Sr., were both legendary warehousemen there, and they've been part of that distillery's history since 1912. Together, the three generations of Johnsons broke down barriers and played a major role in shaping the whiskeys we drink today. After our roundtable session ended, I sat down with Freddie Johnson for a chat.
Tell me, first of all, the story of the Johnson family. 3 generations at Buffalo Trace. You, your dad, and your granddad. How'd your granddad wind up being there?
My grandfather and Colonel Blanton actually met on the riverbank behind the distillery as kids, throwing rocks in the river. They became friends, and they were around there together for 52 years. What's crazy about it is my grandfather really didn't look African-American. So that was really probably we talk about history, and I tell people history can be baggage or it can be an enhancer. But because of what had happened there was a plantation down below the distillery, and Colonel West had fathered a couple of kids by the cook. And so my grandfather didn't really look African-American. He looked like a seasoned Italian guy with big, pretty, wavy, silvery hair. I was fascinated with him. I thought he looked kind of cool, you know. But anyway, because of that, it made it easy for Colonel Blanton to bring him into the whiskey industry. And my grandfather had spent time kind of like as an apprentice with the Irish that had built a lot of the warehouses and the structures around the distillery. And they explained to him about how the whiskey aged. Colonel Blanton would have my grandfather go into the warehouses and pull out these select barrels of whiskey that he would use for entertaining for political purposes. So that set the stage for honey barrels at Buffalo Trace. Along comes my dad. My dad and Elmer were in the Air Force together. Dad was a maintenance guy. He made landing strips. Elmer was a bombardier, and Elmer's planes landed on Dad's old landing strips. So those two old birds were around there together for off and on for 47 years. Granddad and Colonel Blanton were there for 52 years. So when the Elmer was trying to jumpstart the bourbon industry, he has Dad go into the warehouse and pull out some of these old barrels from select places that Granddad had shown him where they were. And he used those to do samples from, and from those barrels that my father laid down, Blanton Bourbon was established. So Blanton's single barrel bourbon became the first single barrel bourbon to ever be sold commercially in the world. And at Elmer's 90th recognition, when he was recognized as one of 3 living master distillers to have a whiskey named after him, when he did that recognition, when he was given the recognition, at that event, he recognized my dad as the one who laid down the barrels that he had chosen to select for Blanton's bourbon to be made. And it was the first public acknowledgement of that, and my dad cried. Because he had kept that inside all these years. So when I came back, all of this was in our family's background. And for me to work at the distillery, even though he was proud of what I'd done and what I'd achieved, just coming back and being at that distillery, no matter what I did, meant more to him than any other gift I've ever given him. And it was all a promise.
We'll get to that in a second, but what was it like growing up around the distillery with your dad and your granddad there?
I was the little kid that got on everybody's nerves. I was like Willy Wonka in a chocolate factory. You have to imagine, at this point, there were 3 miles of railroad tracks around the distillery, so you had steam locomotives coming in there, big box cars full of grain, and they would knock the sliding door open, and the box, they would pull out what they call grain doors, and you would pull out sections of the grain, and it would drop down into the receiving bin. So I got a chance to see all this stuff. I got a chance to go around through the equipment. I just like the way things worked, operations and engineering and stuff like that. And it was fascinating, all the different things that you could do at a distillery as a kid. And it just sparked my interest in that's something I really would like to do.
But you didn't do it, though.
No, it's because the bourbon industry went dead. There was no job. My dad would look at me. He'd come home sometime and he'd say, "Did you cut the grass?" "Yeah." "Well, did you work in the garden?" "Yeah." And I would look at him, and I go to the refrigerator, and he'd say, "What are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for something to eat, but there's nothing here." He said, "You got a problem." He said, "If there's nothing in there for you to eat, you need to get a job and put yourself something in there that you like, because there is food in that refrigerator." And so that's when he told me, he said, you really need to go do something. The bourbon industry, unfortunately, was dead when I got out of school in the 60s. And basically, Buffalo Trace Distillery, as we know it today, was just a storage facility. The company that owned it had even sold off the bottling equipment. So the family that owns it today, the Sazerac Company, purchased it. They put it back together, and believe it or not, Mark, they went from 50 employees to right at 450 full-time employees, and it has become the most award-winning distillery in the world. The cool part is my dad got a chance to see it coming back to life. He got a chance to see me working at that distillery, and he got a chance to be involved with Mark Brown and Meredith Moody and Amy Presky and all these folks. And it became value added. So his quality of life went up. Me being back with him, for me, if I could have ever given my father anything, that gift of just coming back and having him see me walking around the distillery as an employee, probably the best gift I've ever given my dad.
But you also had to give him rent back in the day until you found a real job, right?
I'll tell you about this rent business. He had the nerve to charge me $1 a day for rent. $1 a day.
And this was in the 60s?
Yes. That's a lot of money for me, you know. And I'm like, "Dad, are you serious?" He said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "I'll make you a deal." He said, "If you can get by anywhere else at $28 a month," he said, "let the doorknob be your pathway to your future." Well, that's a challenge. So I went out and I started trying to find somewhere to live. Well, then I found out, you got to pay for water, you got to pay for electricity, you got to get your clothes done. He wasn't going to let me bring my dirty clothes back home. I'm like, wait a minute, they want a deposit? What? I can't park my car? And the kicker was I could not have entertainment in my room. It was only one room. I had no stove. I had to eat out. I had to find some. I'm like, wait a minute. And you have the nerve to charge me $100 a month. So I went back home and I looked at my dad and he just smiled. And I said, when do I pay you your money? And he started laughing. But it was just a joke. And his point was, life is not a gift. And if you really want something, you'll work for it and you'll pay for it. And that was just a message that he was letting me know, that you don't get by free. Everything costs.
So you wind up at AT&T in the interim here doing networking, engineering, and all sorts of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with bourbon, right?
It had nothing to do with bourbon, but the kicker was it had a lot to do with my background. And the way these pieces start to fit, one of the things I thoroughly enjoy to do as a tour guide is to spend time with students, kids in middle school and high school, because that was actually how I got my start, even with AT&T, was I did a project, an electrical project, and a field service agent with 4-H heard about it. And my mom had worked with the field service agents, and they said, you should become a 4-H club member. I'm like, oh, that's a country bumpkin thing. I don't want to do that. They said, no, your project says that that's going to be a pretty good idea. So I said, okay. So I joined. Thought maybe it'd be a good connection to meet some ladies. Figured, all right, let's do this. Well, the project won. And so then I got to go to the regional, and it won. I went to the division, and it won. So I got to go to the national competition in Washington, D.C., and that was my first exposure to another world. But the kicker is, Mark, because of that, when AT&T found out about what I'd done, I became one of the folks that they tried to recruit. And that's actually how I got on, was because someone had told them that I had this crazy knack for taking technical specs and terms and saying them in ways that people could enjoy it, it made sense, and they could visualize what you were trying to get them to understand. And that started it. And that was what AT&T was looking for at the time, was a bridge between marketing and the customers and network engineering and concepts. Isn't that kind of cool?
Very cool. And you were there for the beginning of the internet, so you invented the internet then, right?
Oh no, I'm not getting there. I'm not getting there with another political figure. Oh no.
I couldn't resist.
But the last thing I was involved with was called the Star Network, and that was when they were going to 4E and 5E network configurations. It was the digital network being evolving. And we were part of the group that created the reservation system, where you don't have to call multiple numbers to make reservations for your hotel, your airlines, your rental cars. It's a crankback system that we're able to use, that you can just do it with the prompt of a button. We got national recognition for it, and just as we were finishing up on that project with Bell Labs, that was when my father called and told me he was terminally ill and asked me would I come home. So it worked out very, very nicely, but it caused me to appreciate caregiving.
Your dad asks you to come home, and then he calls Mark Brown, right?
He and Mark had a little encounter. So my dad had outlived all of his buddies, and what they would do is the wives, these widows, would they would all get together, and Dad would, when one of them had a birthday, he would take them out to lunch, and then he would stop by the distillery and get them one of the ancient age shirts. And on these sweatshirts, the way it worked, the verbiage was on the shirt, "I get better with age," and on the back of the shirt was ancient age Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. All right. So on this particular day, Dad comes by the distillery. He's got the ladies in the car. He comes inside to get this lady her shirt, and there are no more, because they're now transitioning from Ancient Age Distillery to Buffalo Trace. So all the Ancient Age stuff had been put away. My dad's in there. Now he's sweating because the lady is waiting for her shirt, and there's nothing to be found. So he's tearing things apart. He's looking through everything. They call Mark Brown and tell him, Mr. Brown said, there is a gentleman down here that's a little bit upset. And Mark says, well, okay. So he comes in, and Mark walks back through there, and he says, hello, sir. He says, what seems to be the bother? And my dad says, I'd just like to know who the hell's running this place. He says, you can't find any damn thing. So he gets to talking to my father, and he finds out that Dad had worked there a number of years, and he found out about the heritage of the family. And then he found out Dad had rolled out every millionth barrel up until the 6 millionth barrel. So then he strikes a deal with my dad for him to stay alive long enough to roll out the 6 millionth barrel. Dad, in the process, tells him that he's got this son that he needs to get him a job. And Mark says, well, send him down to the distillery. We'll try to find something for him to do. I become a tour guide. Dad gets a chance to roll out the 6 millionth barrel. And at 94 years old, he had become the only living person to personally handle every millionth barrel that had ever come through that distillery since Prohibition. So I tell everyone, promises made, promises kept. Life is a journey, and you think you know where you're going, but things happen along the way, and a lot of times it's for the best.
What did you think when you got the call, I guess a few weeks ago, that you had been inducted into were going to be inducted into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame?
I didn't know what to say. I really didn't know. Now, that's hard for a tour guide to say, I have no words, because I didn't even know anything about it. And then the second piece was Eric had said, now you can't say anything about this because, until it's all official, until we make the announcement, you just can't say anything about it. And so then I'm trying to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do, Now I'm like, oh, my Lord, what, I think about Elmer T. Lee and all these guys, and I'm thinking, how do I even fit into, I'm not even in that category. And then some folks started telling me that, oh, I signed the petition. Oh, I did this. Oh, I talked to Amy. And I'm like, what is going on around me? And to this moment, it's like my daughter and my grandson and all of them, they are more excited about it because, to me, it's still overwhelming. It's like, how, you don't do things, well, I just do things because I have fun doing them. And when I encounter people at the distillery, it's for them. It's about them taking the time to come to Buffalo Trace, and my job is to help them understand the distillery and how bourbon is made. So I just considered it doing what I was hired to do. And for this to be the dividend from that by all the lives that I've touched, it's just overwhelming. It's the nicest thing anyone could ever do.
Let's close this and come back around full circle. You talked about Colonel Blanton and your grandfather, and it being easier for the colonel to bring your grandfather in because, for lack of a better term, he could pass, is the term that was used back then. You are the first African-American to be part of this Hall of Fame. And I know you don't want to make a big deal about it, but history will not let us slide if we don't at least acknowledge this fact. What does that mean to you?
I don't know. When somebody told me about this, I said, I really wish it was my dad or my granddad that received that award. I don't. When Eric asked me about this, and I said, I really don't want to even focus on that. And the reason is that I don't want people to think that it was done just because I was an African American. I would rather people to think of it as someone that did something really kind of cool for the bourbon industry who happened to be an African American. And that's kind of how I like to feel. I like to feel that way. A lot of people are surprised when they hear about me, and then when I go to do a tour, they're surprised who I am. But now they look for me, and I hope it's for the message, Mark, that I provide, not because of what I am, but because of who I am.
No arguments there, but speaking only for myself, I can say that I think it is important that when future generations look at the members of the Hall of Fame, that young African-American kids can see somebody in that hall who looks like them and know that there's a place for them in this industry too.
Wow, that's a pretty cool insight. That has now started to surface. There's an African-American Bourbon Society that has over 3,000 members in it that I wasn't even aware that it existed. But I've been dealing with the Lexington Societies and some of the others. Didn't even know that it was there. And when they came to the distillery and started chatting with me, it made me really feel good because they are consumers and they have been consuming bourbon for a number of years also. And so all of a sudden there's this awareness that, wait a minute, it's a lot bigger than just a few folks. This is a very ethnic, diverse market. And I think that the bourbon industry, if for no other reason, is far better off because they took the time to just recognize me.
Freddie Johnson is one of the 3 members of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame's class of 2018. Other families have been inducted in the past into the Hall of Fame as a group, and perhaps one day the Johnsons will too. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Isla Single Malt. Look for the classic Lagavulin 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, the throwback 8-year-old, and coming soon to a whiskey shop near you, this year's edition of the Cask Strength Lagavulin 12-year-old. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Heaven Hill is releasing this year's 3rd and final batch of Elijah Craig barrel-proof bourbon now. I received a sample this week just in time to taste it before leaving for Louisville. Batch C918 is bottled at a whopping 65.7% ABV, and the nose is oaky and aromatic with allspice, a hint of pepper, honey, caramel candy, and dark chocolate fudge. The taste is spicy and intense with black pepper, cinnamon, and chili powder spices, along with vanilla, honey, caramel, and dark chocolate underneath. And the spices fade to a mouth-watering, juicy finish with sweet notes of apple pie, caramel, and honey. I'm scoring the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch C918 a 92. Next up, let's look at the Belle Meade Madeira cask-finished bourbon from Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery in Tennessee. This one is sourced bourbon that's finished in Malmsey Madeira casks from Portugal and bottled at 45.2% ABV. The nose has fruity notes of peaches and apricots, along with creme brulee, honey, and soft spices. The taste has a good balance of spices and fruits with hints of clove, allspice, peaches, vanilla, caramel candy, and honey. And the finish has a nice kick of spices, along with dried fruits and honey. I'm scoring the Belle Meade Madeira Cask Finish Bourbon a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute. But first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, proud to announce the 2018 edition of Parker's Heritage Collection. This year's edition carries on Parker Beam's legacy of excellence and innovation with a unique bourbon finished in orange Curacao barrels that accent the bourbon's own natural hints of citrus. Once again, sales of this year's edition of the Parker's Heritage Collection will benefit the ALS Association. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Now let's look at a couple of master distiller Dave Pickerell's new whiskeys. First up, the Whistle Pig Rye Boss Hog 5, nicknamed the Spirit of Mauve. This one is finished in Calvados casks, and it's bottled at 57.9% ABV. The nose has notes of baked apples, nutmeg, muted rye spices, vanilla, and a touch of rising bread dough. The taste is mouth-coating and vibrant. It explodes in the mouth with a great complexity that balances spices, dried fruits, and apples that gradually combine to a great apple pie taste. It's not an overpowering whiskey, but subtle and elegant, and the finish is amazingly long with gently fading spices and touches of apple pie, nutmeg, and honey. It may well be the best Boss Hog yet. I'm scoring the Whistle Pig Rye Boss Hog 5 a 95. Now, for the most controversial whiskey from Dave Pickerell yet. The blackened American whiskey he created this year in collaboration with Metallica. It uses blackened brandy barrels and a blast of low-frequency sound waves. More on that later. Let's focus on the whiskey first. It's bottled at 46% ABV and is blended from a variety of whiskeys that Dave sourced from several distilleries. The nose has a brandy-like sweetness from those casks with touches of apricots, dried apple chips, toffee, and caramel ice cream topping. The taste is very tart, fruity, and well-balanced with gentle baking spices, hints of apricots and dried apples, and that caramel ice cream topping note that's a bit creamier than caramel candy. It's not overwhelmingly spicy, but very complex, and the finish is aromatic and long with hints of clove, allspice, and honey. Whether you believe the music had anything to do with it or not, it is still one hell of a whiskey. I'm scoring blackened American whiskey a 95. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, and I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 2,300 different whiskeys from around the world at WhiskyCast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. Aging in oak for 12 long years. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes. Bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnnie Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Can I drink this now?
Johnnie Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Had several comments on our last episode and the interview with Marianne Eves of Castle and Key Distillery on its restoration and its opening to the public this past week. Sue Williams, at Real Sue Williams on Twitter, had this comment. Looks and sounds like they did a good job with restoration. Took their time, paid tribute to the past. Nice to see such a phoenix from the ashes type story. And by the way, that distillery is featured on the Architectural Digest website in a new story this week with more pictures of before and after the restoration. Now, I've really got to apologize for being such a smartass on social media this week. Our pal Ed Patrick really deserves the apology. He leads the Companions of the Quake clubs in Canada, and he tweeted with a serious question. Hi, Mark. Do you know any good Scotch presenters in Houston who can also address the haggis? Now, let's be fair. I did admit, first of all, that I don't know anyone in Houston offhand who can perform the legendary Robert Burns address to the haggis and is also a Scotch whiskey presenter. So I asked for help from our listeners in the Houston area. But I just could not resist the urge to have some fun. The second tweet, addressing the haggis isn't hard to do. Hello, haggis. How are you? The hard part is getting the postage stamps to stick to the haggis, when you're addressing it, of course. Well, H. Hemphill at Bunkai H on Twitter said, Thanks, this made me laugh. I think Robbie Burns rolled over in his grave, though, with a winking emoji. I do need to thank Jerry Mann at Jerry D. Mann on Twitter. He came through with a couple of suggestions in the Houston area for Ed. And if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, whether it's a question, suggestion, comment, or just a dad joke, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at WhiskyCast.com or find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@WhiskyCast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close things out now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that makes whiskey unique. And this time around, we're going to talk about the science. You heard my tasting notes just a few minutes ago for the blackened American whiskey that Dave Pickerell created in collaboration with the members of Metallica. It's blasted with low-frequency sound waves in the form of Metallica playlists in the final step of the finishing process. And yes, we have heard about other whiskey makers trying stuff like this before. But before you dismiss the idea as a gimmick, I asked Dave to explain the process and the science behind it.
The first thing is just to know when Metallica came and recruited me, it wasn't so much a hiring as it was a commissioning. And in this case, they didn't say, we want you to make XYZ. They said, make a really cool whiskey to make us proud. And we want to reach our fan base. So I said, great. Before I make the whiskey, I need to understand the band. I mean, I knew the music, but I needed to understand the band. So I dug into the band, and I took away three things. Number one, they're hyper collaborative. I mean, even to the point that when the bottles come out, no one member's allowed to sign. It's either all sign or no sign. Number two, they're out of the box in the way they think about life and things. And number three, they've got a process that they call metallicizing, which is taking something that's already good and kicking it up a notch or two. So I said, great, I'm going to do those three things with the whiskey. So the first thing is, using my influence and network, reached out to distillers all over North America and got whiskeys from everywhere that you would individually be proud to just put a label on and sell it. Got rye from Canada, bourbon from Kentucky, Tennessee whiskey, Indiana whiskey, just whiskey from everywhere. And then took that and played with it and figured out a marriage and married it together so that it's plurality rye, but it's not 51% anything. And so it's a nice, it's savory but not too savory. It's got a lot of corn in it, so it's sweet but not too sweet. So that's collaborative. And it's a little out of the box because nobody's taking 6 or 7 different whiskeys and marrying them together. And then we dropped it in brandy barrels and then hit it with black noise. And we've defined black noise, we've trademarked it. And the concept is to take sound waves and ultra low frequency sound waves and hit the barrel with those and get it low enough and at the right frequency that it causes the molecules of whiskey and wood to vibrate. And this is not rapid aging. This is just getting the whiskey wood interface to vibrate. And pull out some extra caramels from the red layer, which is right behind the char layer. And so they've got Meyer Sound, which is already one of the best sound engineers in the world. They've already got ultra-low frequency subwoofer technology patented. The band already plays music that's really clean and crisp and fast-moving. And so we asked the band members to submit playlists. And then we took a playlist and put transducers on the barrel and hit it with ultra-low frequency sound. And this isn't about playing music to make the barrels feel nice. This is about shaking their guts up. And the idea was only do this if that makes sense. So we put a massive amount of money into a scientific study where we took a blind, and then every few days we would pull a sample. At 8 days, it was obvious to the naked eye that we'd had color change. And that's all we're really looking for, is pulling caramel out, right? And so at 8 days, it was obvious to the naked eye. And we ran it out substantially longer than that. And once we get our patent approved, we're going to publish scientific journals, because this isn't hokey baloney or hocus pocus. There's honest to goodness science behind it. I just tasted a group last week, and we had batch 81 and batch 82. The only difference is the playlist, and they could tell the difference between the two batches.
How does this differ from what other whiskey makers have done with sound waves and music? I'm thinking guys like Ralph Lorenzo at Tuttletown, where they put transducers on the outside of the warehouse and turned the entire warehouse into a speaker cabinet.
There is difference. First of all, there's science behind what we did, because we actually did the science up front to validate what we do. It's not to poo-poo what anybody else is doing, just that we actually did the science on the front end to prove out. that this isn't theory or hype. This is actual honest-to-goodness science behind it. And part of it is getting the frequency low enough. And, and that's what came from my West Point days. West Point's got one of the 3 largest organs in the world. And when I was a cadet, I was up there, and Dr. Davis was playing the organ. He was practicing, and I was the only person in the chapel besides him. And he played Toccata and Fugue in D minor for me. It's the Phantom of the Opera song, which is one of my favorite operatic songs. And the power of the organ was just immense. And when he got done playing it, it was like he switched into Emperor Palpatine. And he looks at me and he goes, "And now for the full effects of the organ." And he hit the lowest note it would play. And I don't remember exactly, I think it was like 16 cycles. But it was so low, he said, "I can only play this for a few seconds because it will cause structural damage to the building." And that was the beginning of my fascination with ultra-low frequency sound. In fact, if you pick the right frequency, you can make water dance. You can cause it to spin to the left. You can cause it to spin to the right. You can cause it to go dead calm. And that's what we're doing, is we're picking the right frequencies. And because the music runs up and down and up and down and up and down through that range, we get different extract levels depending on what songs are being played.
And theoretically, you could blow a barrel apart if it weren't for the steel hoops, right?
I think probably if we dropped it a few more decibel or a few more hertz lower, we might be able to. Who knows? But we're happy with where we are, and the thing is, it's fun, it's interesting. There's science behind it, and the best news is the whiskey actually tastes good, which is the proof in the pudding.
Did the low-frequency sound in the music really make a difference in Blackened? Or was it just a good whiskey to start out with? Without being able to taste samples of the same batch before and after that sonic blast, it really is hard to say. But we do know that sound waves and vibrations do have an effect on water and other liquids. If you put a glass of water next to a speaker and crank up the sound, you can see the water actually vibrating in the glass. And we can feel the effects those sound waves have on us when we listen to music. Remember, our bodies are made up mostly of water. So, theoretically, why would there not be some effect from high-powered sound waves on whiskey? I'd like to see some more experiments along these lines, and taste them, too. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, along with the latest whiskey news, events, cocktail recipes, photos, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of past episodes. Special thanks this week go to Fred Minnick and the team at Danny Wimmer Presents for making this weekend's coverage of the abbreviated Bourbon and Beyond possible. You'll find us online at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you this time around from Louisville, Kentucky, at the abbreviated Bourbon and Beyond Festival. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.